Good afternoon, guys. We'll get started with your review session, and if you have any questions, feel free to tap to the Today's Meet site to make sure that you're in a good spot. Looks like from the number of questions we have, we'll be done in a very short amount of time, but if you do have any questions you want to add in, feel free to be able to ask them. Tomorrow, remember, Chapter 28-29 tests will be taking place first thing, and then Tuesday will be your first of 3 presidential years in office tests, and so please make sure that you are doing well with both of those things. So we'll get started with your review. The first question that I got was asking for an explanation as far as the difference between new nationalism, new freedom, and those two things are really easy to confuse, and so we want to make sure that we're solid with both of them before you take your test tomorrow. We want to first connect the names to the candidates. So new nationalism is Teddy Roosevelt's idea. And new nationalism is an idea where Teddy Roosevelt believes that we still need to embrace the idea of good trust and bad trust. And he's mad at William Howard Taft for having gone after the monopolies so aggressively that he did, where Roosevelt believes that we need to push towards efficiency rather than wiping out all monopolies. We need to get rid of the bad ones. He also starts talking about how his square deal hadn't gone far enough to be able to help out the poor people of the country. And so he was floating ideas of getting involved in other sorts of social reform that was much more aggressive than what we'd seen previously. He was talking about things like a minimum wage for the country. He was talking about possibly creating a healthcare system, a national healthcare system, to help people who are too poor to be able to get the healthcare that they needed because it wasn't provided by their jobs. The competitor against that is going to be Woodrow Wilson with his new freedom. And new freedom is the idea that all monopolies are bad. And Woodrow Wilson's belief is that if he can wipe out all monopolies using a stronger federal government, he can then go back to having small government and small business, where he could then get rid of the governmental tools that were used to break monopolies, but only after he got rid of all of them. The key that you want to notice with new nationalism and new freedom is that Woodrow Wilson will try new freedom for a limited amount of time, and then he'll realize when World War I breaks out in Europe in 1914 that he can't push for breaking down all monopolies, because he'll then lose all the big businesses that could be used to help him win the war. And so he's going to go from new freedom to embracing new nationalism at that time. And what he'll say to the American people and the progressives is that he's largely accomplished what he wanted to with new freedom. And for a lot of more radical progressives, they're going to be frustrated that he didn't wipe out monopolies, but he feels very much like he cannot because of what's going on with his foreign policy. Next question is the Jones Act. The Jones Act, there's 2 of them. The one that you want to know about is with the Philippines. The one with the Philippines announces in 1916 that the Philippines can have their independence once they develop a government that is capable of governing themselves. And for Woodrow Wilson, he doesn't anticipate that happening anytime soon. It's only going to happen after World War II in 1946. But this is something where it announces to the rest of the world that Philippines are going to be a protectorate of the United States as a result of the Jones Act in 1916. There'll also be a Jones Act in 1917 dealing with Puerto Rico and their territory shifts, but that is not something that you'll need to know for tomorrow's test in a survey course. But it too is going to get into defining the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. But the one for tomorrow's test is about the one that's with the Philippines and their potential independence. Isabel, the question about dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy is William Howard Taft's idea to replace big stick diplomacy. His idea is that instead of using the military to try to deal with foreign policy, especially with our Navy, he wants to use businesses, inserting our businesses and our economics into other countries in the hope that we can then influence other countries with that relationship. Dollar diplomacy doesn't go great. Taft will do a number of different things that are going to be controversial. Like in Manchuria, he decides to build a train line, even though Teddy Roosevelt announced to everybody in the area that we wouldn't. And he manages to make China, Japan, and Russia simultaneously mad at the United States for breaking their promise and intervening in that place economically. Taft will also try to use dollar diplomacy in Latin America And eventually he's going to find that there's so much instability and so many things that makes the Americans nervous about the Monroe Doctrine that he is going to invoke the Roosevelt corollary, and he'll use the military to try to intervene in those places as well, like Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, and so on. So with dollar diplomacy, it's Taft's attempt to go a different direction, but eventually he's going to keep on doing what Roosevelt has done with military interventions when he feels the need to do so. The next question is Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot is Teddy Roosevelt's environmentalist right-hand man where it comes to creating national parks and reserves. He's going to be the guy who's helping Teddy Roosevelt to be able to get that accomplished. Pinchot's also important during the Taft presidency because when a guy named Ballinger is in the Secretary of the Interior and he starts selling off some of the lands that Teddy Roosevelt has set aside, Gifford Pinchot brings that to Taft's attention. Instead of supporting Pinchot, Taft is going to fire him and protect his Secretary of the Interior. This is going to be one of the moments that convinces Teddy Roosevelt that Taft is unwinding a lot of his progressive ideas, and that's going to encourage Roosevelt to run in 1912 to try to knock off Taft because he feels like Taft is undoing a lot of the progressive ideas that Roosevelt has done. The next question that I have on the list is Roosevelt's Square Deal. Roosevelt's Square Deal is just the name for all of the domestic plans that Roosevelt has to try to provide a square deal or a fair opportunity for the workers inside the country who he feels haven't been getting a fair shake since the Civil War because of the Gilded Age and laissez-faire economics. He feels like monopolies in many cases have started running the government and there's tons of corruption, and he wants to try to figure out ways to roll that back. So when you take a look at his monopoly breaking, and you take a look at the Meat Inspection Act, Food and Drug Act, all of the different laws that Roosevelt's getting into for reform, he sees all of them as part of a square deal for the workers where they're getting a better situation than what they had with the previous styles of government that would be more slanted towards big business. Next question, Carey and Newlands Act. These laws both are dealing with the same issue, irrigation of westward lands that are west of the 100th meridian, and they are not getting enough moisture to be able to be used as farmland. Both of them will pay people in order to build irrigation systems, both to water the land they're on and also to provide drinking water for the surrounding area. What this is going to do, though, is in an area that is prone to drought, that is way too dry to be sustainable for agriculture on its own, it's going to bring a lot of people out west with the idea that they can then irrigate and use this land for farming. And the connection we wanted to make with that is while it does provide some areas for farmland, it's also going to lead to the Dust Bowl that we're going to see in the 1930s, where this place is going to be an environmental disaster when people don't have enough water to be able to run their farms. Your next question, Payne-Aldrich bill, has to do with William Howard Taft, and Taft got elected with the idea that he'd be a progressive, but your key is, when we think about our political spectrum, Taft is somebody who is progressive, but not as progressive as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had been able to argue with the conservatives and be successful because he realized that the people liked him a lot. Even though the Republican Party was conservative, a lot of those Republicans liked Teddy Roosevelt and trusted his plans. Taft isn't nearly that charismatic, so when it comes time to make decisions about the tariff, progressives desperately want to lower the tariff. And that's kind of what the Payne-Aldrich tariff was going to do until it got in front of the Congress. And then all of these senators started adding in their special interests, and they started increasing the tariff so that in many cases the tariff stayed the same or even bumped up a little bit in some cases. And that made progressives really mad because they believed that Taft was on their side, but Taft instead is making the conservatives in the party more happy by still protecting businesses inside the United States. Payne-Aldrich tariff is another reason why Roosevelt in 1912 decides to run against William Howard Taft, because he believes that Taft is not as progressive as Roosevelt would have been, and so Roosevelt wants to get back in so that he can be pushing his progressive agenda instead. You have, in the next question, two different questions going on, War Industries Board and the Industrial Workers of the World. So let's deal with both of those. Industrial Workers of the World, first of all, this is a brand new labor union. So far you've learned two labor unions you need to know. Knights of Labor in the late 1800s were our first organized labor union that went nationwide, and it was both skilled and unskilled workers And they were somewhat radical in their ideas as far as how much they wanted to push for from their businesses and from government. They stick around until the Haymarket strike, and then with the Haymarket riot, they become seen as radicals and dangerous for our country. A second labor union you learned about is the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, and this was a more moderate labor union that was more focused on what they called bread and butter issues, where they were reluctant to go into strikes. They didn't want to be seen as radicals, especially during that period of nativism in the late 1800s. And so they were very much a more stable labor union, but they were seen as very much more willing to cave into businesses rather than be able to fight in a radical sort of way. The IWW is also nicknamed the Wobblies. They were led by a one-eyed large guy named Big Bill Haywood, who was a radical. He was a socialist who believed that we should destroy the capitalistic system because it was abusing workers. And his slogan for the IWW was, "An injury to one is an injury to all." And so he had no problem threatening business owners with sabotage, work slowdowns, or other sorts of aggressiveness and pushing for very radical changes in favor of the workers. And with the IWW, they were successful in the early 1900s in getting stuff done, but then they also earned for themselves a reputation of being radical. So when we see an anti-radical backlash at the end of World War I with the Red Scare and the Red Summer of Hate, we're going to see that the IWW is going to go from being powerful to being dangerous, and they're going to be torn apart because of that resistance. Big Bill Haywood will actually get deported to Russia because of the fact that he is seen as a communist who is dangerous for our country during a period of anti-communism following World War I. The War Industries Board is very different from that. The War Industry Board is led by Bernard Baruch, and this is an attempt by Woodrow Wilson to streamline the economy of the United States so that we can become a war machine. And so instead of leaving the businesses to run themselves during World War I, he decides to organize all of them. So Bernard Baruch is going to be deciding through the War Industries Board what factories get what supplies, how much stuff they're going to be making, how much they're going to get paid for making all of this stuff. And they have strict quotas that they're trying to maintain to make as many guns and planes and bombs and all that sort of stuff that they can possibly make. And what this is going to end up doing is it's going to help America become a very productive arsenal for World War I. We ramp up our military supplies really quickly, but for a lot of Americans, this very much feels like socialism, where you've got the American government sticking themselves into businesses and telling them how they can and cannot produce stuff, how much they will and will not be producing. And it's one of those elements that while it helps us win the war, is also going to create a backlash after World War I is done, where many Americans feel like the government is getting too big, and they get worried about the role that the government is playing inside of our businesses. The next question that I see here is the Shepard-Towner Maternity Act. This is a Woodrow Wilson bill that doesn't seem on the surface to be that big of a deal, but what it's doing is it's determining that for women, especially giving birth inside the United States, the mortality rates are still way too high for an industrialized country like our own that has the prosperity that we do. So the Shepard-Towner Maternity Act is going to do something on the federal level that everybody thought previously was left to the states or the local area. He's going to devote money to try to provide education and support for women who are pregnant inside the United States to receive education and support. And so this is going to create medical facilities, especially in rural areas where the infant mortality is really high, to try to help women through the pregnancy process so that they can see their success with pregnancies getting better and better. For people who are in favor of progressive reform and the idea of government being a good thing to try to promote betterment of society, they will see this as a positive trend. For many people who are nervous about the progressives, they will see this as yet another example of the federal government getting into stuff that they'd never dealt with previously. It isn't written in the Constitution, and so there's a debate about whether or not the federal government should be taking on this role or should be left to the states, local government, or private charities, which would give them more freedom, but they also haven't demonstrated the interest or the willingness to be able to step in and deal with that sort of problem. So it's one of those emerging issues that we'll study even more in a few chapters when we get to Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal, who will take that program and take it even further. The next question is, why didn't the United States become part of the League of Nations? This is the crux of what's going on at the end of Chapter 29. So at the end of Chapter 29, Woodrow Wilson has his 14 points plan. It's his plan to make sure that we are fighting the war to end all wars, and we're trying to make the world safe for democracy. What's going on, though, is Woodrow Wilson has 14 ideas that he comes over to Europe with, and they are plans to not have secret alliances anymore, reducing the size of the military so that it's not able to fight offensive wars against anybody who's nearby, giving countries self-determination so that they can make determinations for themselves about how they're going to govern themselves. But Woodrow Wilson is going to fail on all of these agenda items because England and France are much more interested in just punishing Germany. For Germany, then, they're going to find with the Treaty of Versailles, they're going to have to pay back, they're going to have to give up their armies, navies, air force, land, and then money through reparations, where they have to pay back the English and French for any debts they racked up in World War I. And they have to accept the blame for World War I. So the Treaty of Versailles is very much not what Woodrow Wilson wanted. The only thing the Americans really get, though, is the League of Nations, which is supposed to be an organization where you could get together and instead of fighting a war, you could go there and mediate. And so he's kind of trying to set up with the League of Nations what Teddy Roosevelt did with the anthracite coal miner strike, where he wanted to be able to have a place to bring two groups together, talk things out before it got violent, and then perhaps we could prevent wars from happening in the future. Woodrow Wilson's problem, though, is he's highly partisan, and so when he goes off to Europe, he doesn't bring any Republicans with him other than Herbert Hoover, who's part of his Food Administration, and he needs Republicans, especially in Congress, to support his viewpoints. In the Senate, they're going to have to approve this treaty, and when none of them are invited over to Versailles, many of them feel slighted. There are some called the irreconcilables who, when Woodrow Wilson comes back, he can't convince them of anything because they hate the idea of the League of Nations. They love George Washington's idea of staying isolated from European affairs. They feel like the war was a mistake, and they'd like to pull back from all foreign entanglements. There are some, though, like Henry Cabot Lodge, who are willing to discuss, but what they want to get rid of is they want to get rid of an element of the League of Nations, which says that if any one country in the League of Nations gets attacked by an enemy, everybody will treat that as an attack on their country, and they will all go to war with the aggressor nation. Now, while America would probably need to have this stipulation to make the League of Nations work so that there weren't any countries in Europe feeling bold enough to take on their enemies while risking an American war, what this means is that any foreign conflict over in Europe now has the possibility of dragging America into it, even if we have no interest in the war itself, which is totally violating what George Washington's advice was about staying out of European entanglements. For Woodrow Wilson, instead of working with Henry Cabot Lodge to see if they can figure out some sort of way to get around the reservations that Lodge has, Woodrow Wilson decides to go around his back, campaign around the country, and try to convince Americans that the Republicans are wrong and to put pressure on them in Congress. And that pretty much causes the Republicans to dig their heels in harder. Woodrow Wilson then had a massive stroke, and that prevented him from continuing this fight. And as the election of 1920 was coming, Woodrow Wilson couldn't get the treaty passed. The Republicans didn't want to change anything. And when Warren G. Harding came in the presidency, he's going to create a separate treaty with Germany ending the war, but we never joined the League of Nations. And so the big problem with World War I is we fought with all these high-minded ideals of making the world safe for democracy, having it be the war to end all wars. And then the treaty essentially made it so that Germany was so mad that they're going to want to go to war eventually because they're so angry. And the only thing we created was the League of Nations that we never joined, and most Americans didn't even understand why that was such a big deal. And so for many Americans, when they get to 1920, they want to return to normalcy. They want to get away from all this progressivism because they feel like a lot of the reforms were good. And most of the reforms that you read about inside your textbook are pretty mainstream reforms where most Americans are pretty glad that they have them. But by the time you get to 1920, there's a feeling that perhaps they've gone far enough, especially when you have a revolution taking place over in Russia. The 1917 revolution is something that's key, and I saw a question that was asking, is this 1917 revolution the one that created the USSR, the Soviet Union? And you're exactly right. That's where it comes from. So in 1917, we have a communist named Vladimir Lenin who is allowed to go back to Russia. He stages a revolution against Tsar Nicholas, the leader of Russia itself. and creates a communist country. And he argues that World War I is a war for the industrialists, for the monopolies. And so he pulls out with the idea that they're going to now become a communist country that's trying to take care of the common worker. And we'll talk more about them as we move from the 20s beyond. But for many people in America, when 1917 we have a communist revolution in Russia, that's scary. And then at the end of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, we're going to be studying in the next chapter how we've got a problem going on in America of anarchism going on. There's a Red Scare that's happening. There's a fear that there are anarchist, socialist, communists who are willing to do radical things. There's two events in 1919 that set a lot of people off, where one event was on Wall Street. Somebody pulled a horse-drawn wagon to Wall Street, parked it, left it behind, and inside the trailer was a bomb on a timer that blew up a huge chunk of Wall Street in a terroristic bombing similar to what we saw taking place with 9/11. This was done by an anarchist who wanted to show the world how displeased he was with the rise of monopolies and big businesses and his desire to instead see an anarchist government take place. Another person was sending bombs around the country, and so in 1919 we had a bomber who was sending pipe bombs to the rich and famous inside the country, including the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. And when he had a bomb sent to his house and it blew the front of his house off, the Attorney General then went on what was called the Palmer Raids, where we're going to have a Red Scare of A. Mitchell Palmer going around and rounding up anybody who's seen as radical anarchists, communists, socialists, labor union people, and whatever. And they're going to be imprisoned, and many of them will be threatened with deportation because they're seen as scary. Weaving into this is the Espionage and Sedition Act, where if you said anything against the war effort, or you were seen as somebody who was working against the war effort, even if you were trying to stop the sale of war bonds or stop people from getting recruited, you could be thrown in prison for that. And so we see at the end of the 1910s, a lot of Americans have seen the reforms done that they wanted, and they're now witnessing that there are radicals who want to more aggressively attack the structures of the United States. And many of them would like to pull back away from that, and they're believing that the radicals who are left are dangerous individuals who want to destroy our country. And that's where we're going to see a conservative turn when we get to 1920. If we can get to a couple terms then that I still have left to cover here. One of the questions was, can I explain the socialists? Socialists are individuals in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, who believed that the government should either take over really important businesses like railroads and utilities and run them as government institutions so they can't gouge people for prices or access because they do hold a monopoly. Or socialists also believe in heavily regulating businesses so they do not have the ability to abuse poor people inside their societies. And so they are very much of the mindset that the government has a role to play to address ills inside society, creating safety nets to try to help out the people who cannot help themselves. And so that's why you see a parallel where you'll hear a lot of people referring to progressives as socialists, because they'll see the two as being the same. Even though if you talk to Teddy Roosevelt, he would argue that what he was trying to do was to stave off socialism. Many people who are conservative will argue that he was taking us towards it instead. One of those people leading us towards socialism was Eugene V. Debs, who was a union organizer in the late 1800s, but he then became a socialist in the early 1900s. His version of socialism, in his mind, was a boiled down version of socialism, different than the one that you'd find in Europe, with the idea of progressive reforms and safety nets for workers and things to try to protect the workers themselves. But for many conservative Americans, they saw him as a radical socialist who was no different than any other of the other European socialists. So you saw him run for president multiple times in the early 1900s inside your textbook. You also saw him get arrested by Woodrow Wilson because of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, because he was seen as not being pro-war and working against the war effort. And still running from jail, he was still able to get thousands of votes for his presidential run while he was locked up in prison. So he's going to be a very controversial figure during that time period where some will love and some will not love him. I see two other questions that are here. Oh, three other questions. Two have to do with the war. The American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, that's the name for the American army that is going over to Europe to fight in World War I. And so they're on an expedition over to World War I to fight overseas. The Doughboys are a nickname for the soldiers. You saw that in the documentary that I had you guys watch over the past couple days. where they get the nickname because of the way that they're polishing their belts with either clay or dough to make them look bright and white. And so that's the reason why they have the nickname that they do. But these are the American soldiers who come over in 1917 until the wars end in 1918. Let's see here. I see one other question, and it has to do with holding companies. And holding companies are confusing, and so it's good that you're asking about this question, because it's what you're going to see, especially Woodrow Wilson dial into with the Clayton Antitrust Act. So in the late 1800s, you learned about how monopolies were created by the Rockefellers and Carnegies and those guys. And then they started creating the Sherman Antitrust Act in government to try to regulate those. But the Trust Act was created because John D. Rockefeller had taken a monopoly, and instead of keeping it for himself, he created a trust company where he then put together himself as the owner of the company, a trust company that was then given all the ownership of all his monopoly companies, kind of created this distinction between a monopoly and a trust. Now that trusts are being regulated, especially with Teddy Roosevelt, what many people in the early 1900s started doing is they started creating holding companies for their monopolies to try to keep them safe from state regulations. The most famous state for this is going to be New Jersey, where New Jersey realized they could attract a lot of businesses if they got rid of a lot of regulations in their state. And so for the state of New Jersey, they wanted no anti-monopoly regulations on the books. And that then attracted almost a whole bunch of the major businesses to create a holding company inside their state. So what that means is, like, John D. Rockefeller might still be located in Ohio, but he might create a branch of his company in New Jersey, which would be the Rockefeller Holding Company, that would be the controller of all of the Rockefeller interests in other parts of the country. Essentially, this could be like a mailbox inside New Jersey, where this would be the official headquarters of the business. And since the official headquarters was in New Jersey, that would be the only state that could then regulate that business outside the federal government regulating it through interstate trade. And so what the Clayton Antitrust Act is doing is it's really cracking down on holding companies and interlocking directorates, where many people on one board of directors would also be on multiple other boards of directors and owning almost all the businesses inside the United States in just a few hands. So that's what's going on with a holding company. It's tricky, but essentially it's just a gimmick being used by a business to try to help protect itself from regulation. You'll still see that nowadays when you hear about businesses with mailboxes or accounts in like the Cayman Islands or something like that. Many businesses still route ways that they can avoid regulations. They can set up their location in a state or a country that is not all that interested in regulating. Let me see here. I don't see any other questions. Pretty light question day, so I'm hoping that that's because you're in really good shape for the test tomorrow. I wish you the best tonight during the football game. I hope your team wins. I'm already winning because we're less than a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting for spring training, and so I'll be happier from this point forward now that we're close to the beginning of baseball season. For you guys then, if you have any other questions, I'll be checking my email. I'm also free during periods 1 and 2 tomorrow, so I'll be checking my email then. If you've got any other questions that pop up. So I've stalled enough. I don't see any other questions popping up. Good luck to you guys tonight, and hopefully everything goes great with your test tomorrow.